The bullet missed Marshal Tucker Reed by inches, shattering the whiskey bottle behind the bar and sending amber liquid cascading across the worn floorboards of the Silver Dollar Saloon in Aurora, Nevada, where the summer heat of 1878 made everything shimmer like a mirage. Tucker dove behind an overturned table, his hand already drawing his Colt revolver with practiced ease. The robbery had gone sideways fast, and now 3 men were shooting their way out of the bank across the dusty street. He'd been nursing a drink after 3 days of tracking cattle rustlers through the hills when all hell broke loose. The marshal's badge on his vest caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the saloon's broken window as he peered around the table's edge. "Stay down," he shouted to the bartender and the handful of patrons who'd flattened themselves against the floor. More shots rang out from outside, followed by the thunder of hooves. Tucker burst through the saloon doors in time to see the 3 bandits racing toward the edge of town, bags of stolen money tied to their saddles. His own horse was tied up at the livery, too far away to give chase now. Sheriff Daniels came running from the other direction, his silver hair wild beneath his hat. "They got away with near $5,000, he wheezed, hand pressed to his side. The old lawman wasn't built for running anymore. Headed east toward the mountains. Tucker holstered his weapon and nodded. "I'll get my horse and supplies, be on their trail within the hour." "Take McNally with you," the sheriff suggested, but Tucker shook his head. "I work better alone, you know that." He'd been a marshal for 4 years now, since he was 24, and he'd learned that partners complicated things. People got hurt when you worried about someone else instead of focusing on the job. The sheriff sighed but didn't argue. Everyone in Aurora knew Marshal Tucker Reed's reputation. He was fair, efficient, and relentless. Once he took up a trail, he didn't stop until he brought his man in, or men in this case. An hour later, Tucker was riding east through the sage-covered hills, following the tracks left by 3 horses moving fast. The Nevada landscape stretched endlessly before him, all browns and greens beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. His horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Copper, knew these trails as well as he did. They'd covered a lot of ground together over the years. By nightfall, he'd gained on them. Their tracks showed they'd slowed down, probably thinking they'd gotten away clean. Tucker made a cold camp that night, not risking a fire that might alert them to his presence. He chewed on dried beef and hardtack, washing it down with water from his canteen, and tried to get a few hours of sleep with his saddle for a pillow. The next morning brought him to a narrow canyon where the tracks split. 2 horses had gone north, but one had broken off south. Tucker studied the prints carefully, noting that the southern track showed a horse carrying more weight. That would be the one with most of the money. He turned Copper south and continued the pursuit. The trail led him higher into the mountains, through pine forests that smelled of resin and earth. Around mid-morning, he spotted smoke rising from a small valley ahead. Tucker dismounted and approached on foot, leading Copper quietly through the trees. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. A small homestead sat nestled against the hillside, with a modest cabin, a barn, and a corral holding a few chickens and a milk cow. But what caught his attention was the woman standing in the yard, holding a rifle pointed steady at a man on horseback. Even from this distance, Tucker recognized him as one of the bank robbers, his nervous horse dancing sideways as the woman kept her weapon trained on his chest. "I said turn around and leave," the woman called out, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I don't care about your story. You're not welcome here." The bandit's hand moved toward his gun, and Tucker didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the trees with his own weapon drawn. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he called out. "Federal Marshal, put your hands up where I can see them." The bandit cursed and actually reached for his gun, which was the last mistake he made that morning. Tucker's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him half out of the saddle. The man hit the ground hard and lay there groaning, his weapon lying useless in the dirt several feet away. Tucker approached carefully, keeping his gun trained on the wounded man while watching the woman from the corner of his eye. She'd lowered her rifle slightly, but still held it ready. As he got closer, he got his first clear look at her face. She was young, probably close to his own age of 28, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her face had the kind of beauty that came from strong bones and clear eyes, but what struck him most was her expression. She looked neither frightened nor relieved, neither angry nor grateful. Her face was completely blank, as if carved from stone, showing absolutely no emotion at all. "Madam," Tucker said, tipping his hat while keeping his gun on the bandit. "Marshall Tucker Reed. This man robbed the bank in Aurora yesterday. I'll need to tie him up and see to that wound before I take him back." The woman nodded once, but said nothing. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just watched with those expressionless eyes as Tucker bound the bandit's hands and used the man's own neckerchief to bandage the shoulder wound. It wasn't fatal, barely more than a graze, but it bled enough to keep the fight out of him. "You got a barn where I can secure him while I check for the money?" Tucker asked. Again, the woman just nodded and walked toward the barn without a word. Tucker hauled the bandit to his feet and followed, half carrying the man who'd started to feel sorry for himself and was whimpering about his shoulder. Inside the barn, Tucker found a support post and tied the bandit securely to it. "Please," the bandit moaned, "I need a doctor." "You'll get one when we reach Aurora," Tucker said flatly. "Should have thought about that before you drew on a marshal." He went back outside where the woman stood in the yard, still holding her rifle loosely at her side. Tucker retrieved the bandit's horse and found 2 bags stuffed with cash tied to the saddle. At least this part of the job was done. "Madam, I'm grateful for your help in detaining this man," Tucker said, walking over to her. "Might have gotten complicated if he'd made it past your property." The woman looked at him with those same blank eyes and said nothing at all. Not a word. Her face remained completely expressionless. Tucker tried again. "I'll need to rest my horse and get some water before heading back, if that's all right with you. It's been a hard ride." This time she gestured toward the well without speaking, then turned and walked back toward her cabin. Tucker watched her go, puzzled and intrigued in equal measure. In all his years as a lawman, he'd met plenty of people. Angry people, scared people, grateful people, hostile people. But he'd never met anyone who showed absolutely nothing on their face. It was like looking at a beautiful painting that had been drained of all color. He tended to copper first, giving the gelding water and some grain he found in the barn, checking on the bandit who sat slumped against the post, and then walking back to the cabin. He knocked on the door, hat in hand. The woman opened it and looked at him expectantly, still with that same blank expression. "I was wondering if I might trouble you for some food," Tucker said. "I can pay, of course. Been eating trail rations for 2 days and could use a hot meal before the ride back." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped back to let him in. The cabin was small but immaculately clean. A fire burned in the stone hearth, and a pot of something that smelled wonderful simmered over the flames. Simple furniture filled the single room, a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with preserves and supplies. Everything spoke of someone living alone and making do with careful efficiency. The woman ladled stew into a bowl and set it on the table with a spoon and a chunk of bread. Tucker sat down carefully, feeling oddly like an intruder despite the invitation. He ate slowly, aware of her moving around the cabin, checking on something in a basket, straightening things that didn't need straightening. "This is real good," he said between bites. "Best thing I've eaten in a week." No response. She didn't even look at him. "You live here alone?" he asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. Obviously she did. Must get lonely up here in the mountains. Nothing, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Tucker finished his meal in silence, wondering what had happened to this woman to make her so closed off from the world. He'd seen people retreat into themselves after trauma, soldiers during the war, women who'd lost families to violence or disease. But this was different. She functioned perfectly well, took care of herself, even faced down armed men with courage. She just didn't show anything, didn't engage with other people at all. He stood and reached into his pocket for some coins, setting them on the table. "For the meal and the water, I'm grateful." She looked at the coins, then at him, and for just a moment he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, but it was gone so fast he might have imagined it. She pushed the coins back toward him and shook her head. "You sure?" Tucker asked. "It's no charity. You earned it with that stew." Another shake of her head, firmer this time. Tucker picked up the coins and nodded. "Well, thank you kindly then." He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Madam, if you don't mind me asking, what's your name?" She hesitated, and he could see her debating whether to answer at all. Finally, she spoke for the first time since he'd entered the cabin. "Katherine." Her voice was soft and hoarse, as if she didn't use it much. "Katherine Finch." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Finch," Tucker said, tipping his hat again. "And thank you again for your hospitality." He walked back to the barn, checked on his prisoner who'd fallen into a sullen silence, and prepared copper for the journey back. The other two bandits had gotten away for now, but he had one of them and most of the money. The sheriff would be pleased, and Tucker could organize another posse to track the remaining pair. As he led both horses out of the barn, the bandit stumbling along behind tied to his saddle, Tucker glanced back at the cabin. Katherine Finch stood in the doorway, watching them leave with that same expressionless face. Something about her pulled at him, made him want to stay and figure out the mystery of what had happened to steal all the joy from such a beautiful woman. But duty called, and Tucker Reed never shirked his duty. He turned Copper west and started the long ride back to Aurora. The trip took 2 days, slowed by the wounded prisoner and the need to stop frequently. Tucker delivered the bandit to the sheriff's office, turned over the recovered money to the bank, and filed his report. Then he organized a posse of 6 men to track the remaining 2 robbers. But even as he rode back out into the desert, following the northern trail this time, Tucker's mind kept drifting to that lonely cabin in the mountains and the woman who never smiled. Katherine Finch. The name suited her somehow, simple and elegant and a little bit sad. The posse tracked the other 2 bandits for 5 days before cornering them in a canyon and bringing them back to Aurora in irons. Neither of them had any of the stolen money left, having spent it in various gambling halls and saloons along their route. But at least they were caught, and justice would be served. Tucker took his payment from the territorial government, sent his usual portion back to his sister's family in Kansas City, and tried to settle back into the routine of keeping the peace in Aurora. But he found himself restless, distracted, thinking about things he normally never considered. He'd been a lawman since the war ended, focusing entirely on his work. There'd been women here and there over the years, pleasant enough company for a night or a week, but nothing that made him want to change his solitary life. He'd convinced himself he preferred it that way, that having someone to worry about would interfere with his job. Now, 3 weeks after delivering the bank robbers to justice, Tucker sat in the Silver Dollar Saloon nursing a whiskey and admitting to himself that he couldn't stop thinking about Katherine Finch. not in the way he usually thought about women, though she was certainly beautiful. No, he was haunted by that blank expression, by the mystery of what could hurt someone so badly that they stopped showing any emotion at all. He told himself it was none of his business, that she was clearly managing fine on her own, that he had no reason to ride back up into those mountains. But the thoughts kept coming anyway, intruding at odd moments throughout his days. Finally, on a Sunday morning when Aurora was quiet and peaceful, Tucker saddled Copper and headed east. He told himself he was just checking on her, making sure everything was all right. The territory could be dangerous for a woman living alone. It was his duty as a marshal to look in on isolated homesteads now and then. The ride took most of the day, and the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon when he rode into the small valley where Catherine's cabin sat. Everything looked much as it had before. Chickens scratched in the yard, the cow grazed in the corral, smoke rose from the chimney. Katherine was outside, hanging laundry on a line stretched between two posts. She looked up at the sound of hooves and froze, a sheet clutched in her hands. Tucker saw her face, that same blank expression, and felt a strange ache in his chest. He dismounted and approached slowly, hat in hand. "Evening, Miss Finch. I hope I'm not intruding. I was riding through the area and thought I'd check on you, make sure everything's been peaceful since the last trouble." She watched him for a long moment, then hung the sheet on the line with careful precision. She didn't speak, but she didn't turn him away either. "I also wanted to thank you again for your help that day," Tucker continued. "The bandit and his friends are all in jail now, awaiting trial. The bank got most of its money back. None of that would have happened so smoothly if you hadn't stood your ground like you did." Katherine picked up her empty basket and walked toward the cabin. Tucker followed at a respectful distance, unsure if he was welcome or if she was hoping he'd just leave. But when she reached the door, she looked back at him and then at the well, giving him silent permission to water his horse. Tucker took care of Copper, taking his time with it, wondering what he was really doing here. The sun sank lower, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. It would be dark soon, too dark to safely ride back through the trails. He should leave now if he was going to make it to a reasonable camping spot. Instead, he walked to the cabin and knocked on the door. Katherine opened it, looked at him with those expressionless eyes, and waited. "Miss Finch, I know this is an imposition, but it's getting dark and I'm wondering if you might allow me to sleep in your barn tonight. I'll be gone at first light and won't trouble you beyond that. I can pay for the accommodation." She studied him for what felt like a very long time. Tucker could almost see her mind working behind those blank eyes, weighing the risks of having a stranger stay on her property overnight. Finally, she nodded once and gestured toward the barn. "Thank you," Tucker said, relief flooding through him. "I'm grateful." He started to turn away, but she reached out and touched his arm, so briefly he almost missed it. When he looked back, she was holding a wrapped bundle that smelled like fresh bread. She pressed it into his hands and then closed the door without a word. Tucker walked to the barn feeling oddly moved by the small gesture. He set up his bedroll in the hayloft, ate the bread which was still warm and delicious, and lay back looking up at the rafters. Moonlight streamed through gaps in the boards, and somewhere an owl hooted in the darkness. He thought about Katherine Finch alone in her cabin, wondered what her story was, wondered if she ever felt lonely in this isolated place. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, he dreamed of blank faces and silent sorrows he couldn't understand. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of fresh coffee. Tucker climbed down from the hayloft and found Katherine in the yard, tending to her chickens. She glanced at him briefly, then continued scattering feed from a bucket. "Morning," Tucker said. "I'll be out of your way shortly." She straightened and walked to the cabin, returning a moment later with a tin cup full of steaming coffee. She handed it to him without meeting his eyes. "Thank you," Tucker said, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "You're very kind." He sipped the coffee slowly, watching her move around the yard with efficient grace. She gathered eggs from the chicken coop, checked on the cow, pulled a few weeds from a small vegetable garden he hadn't noticed before. Every movement was purposeful and practiced, the routine of someone who'd lived alone for quite some time. "You have a nice place here," Tucker said, breaking the silence. "How long have you lived in these mountains?" Katherine paused in her work but didn't answer. Tucker wasn't sure if she would, but after a moment she held up 3 fingers. 3 years, he asked, and she nodded. "That's a fair while. Must have been difficult setting all this up by yourself." She shrugged slightly and went back to pulling weeds. Tucker finished his coffee and walked over to her, handing back the cup. "Can I ask you something, Miss Finch? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I'm wondering what brought you up here to live alone like this." Her hands stilled in the dirt. For a long moment she didn't move at all. Then she stood, brushed off her skirt and looked at him directly for the first time. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, gray-blue and distant. He saw pain there, deep and old, buried beneath layers of careful control. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Tucker saw her struggle with it, saw something almost like panic flash across her face before the blank mask settled back into place. She shook her head and turned away, walking quickly toward the cabin. Tucker felt like he'd pushed too hard, intruded where he had no right to be. "I'm sorry," he called after her. "I didn't mean to upset you. I'll go now." He saddled Copper quickly, feeling like a fool. Whatever had happened to Katherine Finch was none of his business, and here he was poking at old wounds like some insensitive idiot. He mounted up and turned the gelding toward the trail, but before he could leave, Katherine emerged from the cabin holding something in her hand. She walked over to him and held up a small photograph in a tarnished frame. Tucker took it carefully and looked at the image. A young family smiled up at him, a man and woman with a little girl between them, maybe 4 or 5 years old. The woman in the photograph was Katherine, younger and different in a way that took Tucker a moment to identify. She was smiling in the picture, her whole face lit up with joy. "Your family?" Tucker asked softly, and Katherine nodded. "What happened to them?" She took the photograph back and pointed to the little girl, then made a gesture of coughing, clutching her throat. Then she pointed to the man and made the same gesture. Her face remained blank throughout, but Tucker could see her hands trembling slightly. "Sickness," he said, understanding flooding through him. "I'm so sorry, Miss Finch. That's a terrible loss." Katherine nodded once, then looked at him with those empty eyes and touched her mouth, then her chest, shaking her head. Tucker understood. The grief had been so profound that something in her had broken. The joy had gone out of her, and with it, her ability to express any emotion at all. "Thank you for telling me," Tucker said gently. "That took courage." She shrugged as if it didn't matter and turned back to the cabin. But Tucker felt like something had shifted between them. Some small connection had been made. He rode away from the homestead feeling troubled and moved in equal measure. Back in Aurora, Tucker tried to focus on his work. He broke up fights, arrested a drunk who shot up the saloon, escorted a prisoner to Carson City for trial, investigated a claim-jumping dispute in the hills north of town. But no matter how busy he kept himself, he found his thoughts drifting back to Katherine Finch and her silent sorrow. 2 weeks later, he made the ride to her cabin again. This time he brought supplies with him, flour and sugar and coffee, telling himself she might need them living so far from town. Katherine accepted the supplies with a nod but no other acknowledgement. She didn't invite him in, but she brought out another cup of coffee and sat with him on the porch steps while they drank it in silence. Tucker found himself talking to fill the quiet, telling her about Aurora and the people there, about funny incidents and interesting characters. He didn't expect her to respond, and she didn't, but he thought he saw her face soften slightly as he described old Mrs. Henderson chasing the banker down Main Street with a rolling pin after he tried to foreclose on her boarding house. When he left that day, Katherine walked him to his horse. As he swung into the saddle, she touched his arm again, that same brief contact, and looked up at him. Her expression was still blank, but something in her eyes seemed warmer, less distant. The visits became a pattern. Every week or two, Tucker would ride out to the cabin with some excuse, supplies or news or just checking on her safety. Katherine never spoke, never smiled, never showed any emotion on her face. But she started letting him stay longer, accepting his presence with something that might have been the beginning of trust. Sometimes he would help with chores, fixing a fence rail that had come loose or replacing a broken shutter. She would work alongside him in silence, and Tucker found he didn't mind the quiet. There was something peaceful about it, about being with someone who didn't expect anything from him except his presence. Months passed this way. Summer turned to autumn, and the mountains blazed with color. Tucker brought Katherine a warm coat he'd bought in Carson City, worried about her facing winter alone. She accepted it with a nod and immediately tried it on, and Tucker thought he saw something almost like pleasure in her eyes before the blank mask returned. "It suits you," he said, and meant it. The dark blue wool brought out the color in her eyes and made her hair seem lighter by contrast. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Tucker sat on Katherine's porch steps and finally admitted to himself what he'd been denying for months. He was falling in love with her, with this silent, damaged woman who never smiled, who kept all her pain locked away behind a blank face. He loved her gentleness with her animals, her quiet strength, the way she managed her solitary life with dignity and grace. He loved the small gestures of kindness she showed him, the coffee and bread, the way she sometimes sat with him in companionable silence. He had no idea if she felt anything for him at all. He couldn't read her expressions because she had none. He didn't know if his visits were a welcome break in her isolation or just something she tolerated. But he knew he couldn't keep coming here without being honest about his feelings. "Katherine," he said, using her first name for the first time, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked at him from where she stood near the corral, her face unreadable as always. Tucker stood and walked over to her, his heart beating hard against his ribs. "I know I have no right to say this. I know you've suffered losses I can't even imagine, but I need you to know that I care about you. More than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. I look forward to these visits more than anything else in my life. You've become important to me." Katherine stared at him with those blank eyes, and Tucker felt his courage faltering. What had he expected? That she would suddenly smile and fall into his arms. She was incapable of showing emotion, and here he was burdening her with his feelings like a selfish fool. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I shouldn't have said anything. I'll go now, and I won't bother you again if you don't want me to." He turned toward his horse, but Katherine grabbed his arm, holding him in place with surprising strength. When he looked back at her, he saw something in her face he'd never seen before. It wasn't quite an expression, more like the ghost of one, a subtle shifting of muscles that suggested distress. She pulled him back toward the cabin and led him inside. From a drawer in her small dresser, she took out paper and a pencil. She sat at the table and began to write, her hand moving quickly across the page. When she finished, she handed the paper to Tucker. He read her neat handwriting with growing amazement. I have not felt anything in 3 years, not joy or sorrow or anger or fear. It all died with my husband and daughter. But when you visit, something moves inside me, something I thought was gone forever. I don't know what it is or what it means. I don't know if I can ever be more than what I am now, but I want you to keep coming. Please don't stop visiting. You make the silence less empty. Tucker looked up from the paper to find Katherine watching him with those winter sky eyes. "Thank you for telling me this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I promise you, I'll keep coming as long as you want me to. I don't expect anything from you except what you're willing to give. Just being here with you is enough." Katherine reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It was the most deliberate touch she'd ever initiated, and Tucker felt the warmth of it all the way to his bones. They sat like that as darkness fell outside, hands touching, connected by something fragile and precious and new. Winter came to the Nevada mountains with snow and bitter cold. Tucker worried about Katherine alone in her isolated cabin, and his visits became more frequent. He brought firewood and supplies, fixed drafts in the walls, made sure she had everything she needed to survive the harsh weather. On one visit in late December, he arrived to find Katherine struggling to free her cow from where it had gotten its leg caught in broken boards in the corral. The animal was panicking, thrashing and bellowing, and Katherine was trying to calm it while avoiding its hooves. Tucker jumped in immediately, speaking soothingly to the cow while working to pry the boards apart. The wood was frozen and stubborn, but finally, he managed to create enough space for the cow to pull its leg free. The animal limped away to the other side of the corral, leaving Tucker and Katherine standing in the trampled snow, both breathing hard from the effort. "Is the leg broken?" Tucker asked, and Katherine shook her head. She walked over to examine the cow more carefully, running her hands down its leg with practiced care. The animal had calmed under her touch, and Tucker watched as she checked for serious injury. Satisfied that it was just bruised and scraped, Katherine turned back to Tucker and did something that shocked him completely. She smiled. It was barely there, the tiniest upward curve of her lips, gone almost as soon as it appeared. But Tucker saw it, and his heart leaped in his chest. "Did you just smile?" he asked wonderingly. "Katherine, you smiled." Immediately, her face went blank again, and she looked almost frightened. She turned away and walked quickly toward the cabin. Tucker followed, not willing to let this moment pass without acknowledgement. "Katherine, wait," he called. "Please don't be scared. It's a good thing. It means you're healing." She stopped at the cabin door, her hand on the latch, her back to him. Tucker came up behind her, close but not touching. "I know it must feel strange after so long. Maybe even wrong, like you're betraying their memory. But Katherine, your husband and daughter wouldn't want you to live without joy forever. They'd want you to heal." Katherine's shoulders shook slightly, and Tucker realized with shock that she was crying. Silent tears ran down her face, the first show of real emotion he'd seen from her. He turned her gently to face him and pulled her into his arms. She stood stiff and uncertain for a moment, then collapsed against him, her body shaking with silent sobs. Tucker held her while she cried, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring gentle reassurances. "It's all right. Let it out. You've been holding it in too long." They stood like that in the cold until her tears subsided. Katherine pulled back and looked up at him, her face blotchy and her eyes red, but somehow more alive than he'd ever seen it. She touched his face tentatively, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, and Tucker held perfectly still, barely breathing. Then she stood on her toes and kissed him, soft and uncertain and achingly sweet. Tucker's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and he kissed her back with all the longing he'd been holding inside for months. When they finally broke apart, Katherine was actually showing expression on her face, confusion and wonder and something that might have been the beginning of happiness. "Come inside," Tucker said softly. "You're freezing." They went into the cabin and Katherine made coffee with shaking hands. They sat at the table and Tucker reached across to take her hand. "Talk to me," he said. "Use words if you can. I need to know what you're feeling." Katherine's mouth worked silently for a moment, and Tucker could see her struggling to form words. Finally, in that hoarse, unused voice, she whispered, "Scared, I'm so scared." "Of what?" "Of feeling again. Of losing again, of everything." Tucker squeezed her hand. "I can't promise you won't ever feel pain again. Life doesn't work that way, but I can promise that you won't face it alone." "Not anymore, not if you'll have me." Katherine looked at him with those winter eyes now bright with unshed tears. "Why? Why would you want someone as broken as me?" "You're not broken," Tucker said firmly. "You're wounded, there's a difference. Broken things can't be fixed, but wounds heal. And Katherine, you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Living up here alone, managing everything by yourself, facing down armed men without flinching. That's not broken, that's courage. I don't feel courageous, I feel empty. Not as empty as you used to be though, right? You felt enough to kiss me just now. You felt enough to smile when we saved your cow. It's coming back, Katherine. Slowly maybe, but it's coming back." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Stay tonight," she whispered. "Please, I don't want to be alone." Tucker's heart hammered in his chest. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure of anything, but I know I want you here." That night, Tucker slept on the floor by the fire while Katherine took the bed, both of them fully clothed and proper. But it felt intimate anyway, sharing the small cabin through the long winter night, hearing each other breathe in the darkness. Tucker lay awake for hours, thinking about the woman in the bed across the room, about the tiny smile she'd shown him, about the way she'd kissed him with such tentative hope. He stayed 3 days this time, and during those days, he saw more expressions on Katherine's face than in all the previous months combined. She frowned when she burned the biscuits. She looked pleased when a hen laid an unexpected egg. She showed frustration when a fence repair went wrong. And once, when Tucker told her a particularly absurd story about a drunk who tried to arrest the sheriff thinking he was the criminal, she actually laughed. Just a small sound, quickly stifled, but definitely a laugh. "There it is," Tucker said with delight. "There's the woman in that photograph." Katherine's smile faded. "I'll never be that woman again. That woman had everything, I have nothing." "That's not true. You have this place, your animals, your strength. And if you want, you have me. Not to replace what you lost. Nothing could do that, but as something new, something different." Katherine reached for her paper and pencil, writing quickly. "I don't know if I can love again. I don't know if that part of me still works." Tucker read it and looked up at her. "Then we'll take our time and figure it out together. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people keeping each other company. That's enough for now." When Tucker finally rode back to Aurora, he carried with him the memory of Katherine's smile and the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to happiness. He threw himself into his work with renewed purpose, counting the days until he could visit her again. But fate had other plans. A gang of outlaws hit a stagecoach near the California border, killing the driver and making off with a strongbox full of gold. The territorial governor wanted them tracked down immediately, and sent word that Marshal Tucker Reed was to lead the pursuit. It was the kind of assignment that could take weeks or even months. Tucker sent a message through a trapper who worked the mountains, asking him to stop by Katherine's cabin and let her know he'd be gone for a while. Then he gathered a posse and headed west into the Sierra Nevada. The chase was brutal and frustrating. The outlaws were smart, covering their tracks and splitting up when pursued. Tucker and his men spent 6 weeks in the wilderness, living rough and pushing hard. They finally cornered the gang in an abandoned mining camp and arrested 4 of them after a brief gunfight that left 1 outlaw and 1 posse member wounded. By the time Tucker got back to Aurora, it was late February and he was exhausted, hungry, and desperate to see Katherine. He filed his reports, handed over the prisoners, and headed straight for the mountains despite the sheriff's suggestion that he rest first. The ride to Katherine's cabin seemed to take forever. Tucker pushed Copper harder than he should have, anxiety gnawing at him. What if she'd retreated back into her blank silence while he was gone? What if she'd decided she didn't want him visiting anymore? What if something had happened to her alone up there in the winter wilderness? When he finally rode into the valley, everything looked peaceful. Smoke rose from the chimney. The animals were in their usual places. Tucker dismounted and walked to the cabin door, his heart pounding. Katherine opened the door before he could knock. She looked at him for a long moment, her face showing clear worry, then relief, then something that might have been joy. Then she threw her arms around his neck and held him tight. Tucker wrapped her in his embrace, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her against him. "I'm sorry I was gone so long," he murmured. "I came as soon as I could." Katherine pulled back and looked up at him, and Tucker saw tears streaming down her face. But these were different from the tears she'd shed before. These were tears of relief and happiness, accompanied by a smile that lit up her entire face. "You came back," she said, her voice stronger than he'd ever heard it. "I was afraid you wouldn't." "Katherine Finch, I will always come back to you," Tucker said, cupping her face in his hands. "Always. Nothing could keep me away." She pulled him inside and made him sit by the fire while she heated up stew and fussed over him like he was the one who needed taking care of. Tucker watched her move around the cabin, seeing a grace and energy in her movements that hadn't been there before. "You're different," he said finally. "Something's changed." Katherine sat down across from him and nodded. "While you were gone, I had a lot of time to think about you, about what you said about my life, and I realized something. I've been punishing myself for 3 years for surviving when they didn't. I've been living, but not really living, just going through motions, and I thought that was what I deserved." "Katherine, let me finish," she said, and Tucker was amazed at the firmness in her voice. "But then you came into my life, and you saw something in me worth caring about. Even when I was blank and silent and damaged, you kept coming back. You made me realize that maybe I'm not being punished. Maybe I survived for a reason. Maybe I'm meant to live fully again, not just exist." "You are," Tucker said intensely. "You absolutely are." "It's still hard," Katherine admitted. "I still have days where the grief overwhelms me and I can't feel anything at all, but they're getting fewer. And when they come, I think about you and it helps." Tucker stood and pulled her up with him, holding both her hands. "Katherine, I love you. I've loved you for months, maybe from the first moment I saw you standing in that yard with your rifle. I love your strength and your courage and the way you fought your way back from darkness. And I want to spend my life loving you if you'll let me." Katherine's eyes widened, and for a moment her face went blank again. Tucker's heart sank, thinking he'd pushed too far too fast. But then expression flooded back into her features, joy and fear and hope all mixed together. "I love you too," she whispered, and saying the words seemed to unlock something in her. "I love you, Tucker Reed. I never thought I'd say those words to anyone again, but I do. I love you." Tucker kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Katherine kissed him back with a passion that took his breath away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Tucker rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Come down to Aurora and marry me." I know you love this place and we can keep the cabin, come up here whenever you want. But let me take care of you. Let me share your life. Say yes, Katherine." Katherine pulled back and looked at him seriously. "You need to understand what you're asking for. I'm not going to wake up one day and be completely healed. The sadness is part of me now. I'll have bad days. Days when I can't smile or laugh or show you what I'm feeling. Days when the memories overwhelm me." "I know that," Tucker said, "and I'm not scared of it. We all carry scars, Katherine. Mine just don't show as clearly as yours." "What scars?" she asked softly. Tucker sighed and led her to sit on the bed. "I was in the war, saw things no one should see. Lost friends, killed men, watched the world tear itself apart. When it ended, I felt hollow inside. I threw myself into being a lawman because it gave me purpose, something to focus on besides the memories. But it was just another way of existing without really living." He took her hand. "Until I met you, you made me feel something again. Made me want something besides the next job, the next arrest. You made me want a life, Katherine. A real life with someone I love. So yes, I understand about bad days and scars. And I'm telling you they don't matter. We'll face them together." Katherine was quiet for a long moment, and Tucker could almost see her thinking it through, weighing the risks against the possibilities. Finally, she looked up at him with clear eyes and nodded. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Tucker let out a whoop of joy that made Katherine laugh, an actual full laugh that rang through the cabin like music. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing now, and when he set her down, he kissed her again, pouring all his love and hope and joy into it. They were married a month later in Aurora's small church, with Sheriff Daniels serving as best man and Mrs. Henderson crying happily in the front pew. Katherine wore a simple dress of pale blue, and Tucker thought she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. When the preacher asked if she took Tucker to be her husband, she answered in a clear voice that carried through the church. "I do." The transformation in Katherine over the following months was gradual but profound. She smiled more often, though still not as easily as most people. She laughed at Tucker's stories and showed frustration when things went wrong and cried when she was sad. She was learning to live with her full range of emotions again, and watching her blossom was the greatest gift of Tucker's life. They split their time between Aurora, where Tucker continued his work as marshal, and the cabin in the mountains. Katherine kept her animals and her garden, and Tucker helped expand the homestead. They talked about someday building a bigger house there, maybe when Tucker retired from law enforcement. Life wasn't perfect. Katherine still had dark days when the grief pulled her down and she retreated into silence. But true to his word, Tucker weathered those storms with her, giving her space when she needed it and comfort when she allowed it. And gradually, the dark days became less frequent. One evening about a year after their wedding, they were sitting on the porch of the mountain cabin watching the sunset. Katherine leaned against Tucker's shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them comfortable in the companionable silence that had become their habit. "Do you remember the first time you came here?" Katherine asked suddenly. "I do. You were pointing a rifle at a bank robber. I thought you were the bravest woman I'd ever seen." Katherine shook her head. "I wasn't brave, I was numb. I didn't care what happened to me, so I wasn't afraid." "That's not the same as courage." "Maybe not," Tucker conceded. "But you're brave now, choosing to feel again, to love again after what you lost. That takes real courage." Katherine was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you know when I first really saw you? Not just looked at you, but actually saw you. When? That first morning when you were leaving. You said something to me, do you remember?" Tucker thought back to that morning, trying to recall his words. "I thanked you for your hospitality, I think. Before that. When you were looking at me and the sunrise behind me. You said, "You're the most beautiful thing here." And for just a second, I felt something. Just a flicker, but it was the first feeling I'd had in 3 years. That's when something started to crack open inside me. Tucker pulled her closer, remembering that moment. He'd said it without thinking, struck by the way the early light had caught in her hair and highlighted her features. He hadn't expected her to even register the words. "I meant it," he said. "You were. You are." Katherine turned to look at him, and her face showed clear emotion now. Love and contentment and just a touch of lingering sadness that he knew would always be part of her. "You gave me back my life, Tucker Reed. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't need to thank me. Just love me. That's all I need." "I do love you, so much it scares me sometimes." "Good," Tucker said, kissing the top of her head. "That means you're fully alive again. Life should be a little bit scary. It means you have something to lose, something worth protecting." They sat in silence as the sun sank below the mountains and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, and the chickens settled into their coop for the night. Everything was peaceful and right. "Tucker," Katherine said after a while, "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, looking up at him with eyes that showed clear hope and just a touch of fear. "To be a mother again. To try, at least. I know nothing can replace what I lost. But I think I could love another child without betraying the memory of my daughter. What do you think?" Tucker felt his throat tighten with emotion. He knew what it cost Katherine to say this, to open herself up to that possibility and all the fear that came with it. "I think," he said carefully, "that you would be an amazing mother, and I would be honored to raise children with you, but only if you're truly ready. There's no rush." "I am ready," Katherine said. "Or at least I'm as ready as I'll ever be. I want to build a life with you, Tucker. A full life, with all the joy and risk that comes with it. I've been half dead for too long. I want to be fully alive." Tucker pulled her into his arms and held her close, feeling her heart beat against his chest. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll build a life together, and whatever comes, we'll face it side by side." Katherine pulled back and looked up at him with a smile, and Tucker marveled at how natural it looked on her face now. Not the painted-on smile of someone pretending to be happy, but a real expression of genuine joy. The blank mask was gone, replaced by a living, feeling woman who'd fought her way back from the darkness. "I love you," she said. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't even see myself." "Always," Tucker promised. "I'll always see you, Katherine. And I'll always love you." They kissed as the stars came out above them, two wounded souls who'd found healing in each other, who'd learned that love could bloom even in the hardest soil. The mountains stood silent around them, bearing witness to their promise, sheltering them in the place where their love had begun. The following years brought changes and challenges, joy and sorrow in equal measure. Katherine did become pregnant, and Tucker watched with tender concern as her belly swelled with their child. He saw her fear as the due date approached, saw her wrestle with memories of the daughter she'd lost. But he also saw her determination to embrace this new life, to honor her past without being trapped by it. Their son was born on a spring morning in 1880, healthy and loud and perfect. They named him James after Tucker's father, and when the midwife placed the baby in Katherine's arms, Tucker saw something in his wife's face he'd never seen before. Pure, uncomplicated joy. "He's beautiful," Katherine whispered, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the tiny person they'd created. "Oh, Tucker, he's so beautiful." Tucker knelt beside the bed, one arm around Katherine, one finger caught in baby James's impossibly small fist. "He is, just like his mother." Motherhood brought its own struggles. Katherine sometimes woke in the night panicked, needing to check that James was breathing. She was overprotective at first, scared to let him out of her sight. But gradually, as the weeks turned to months and James thrived, she learned to relax into the role. Tucker watched her blossom as a mother, saw her discover reserves of love she'd thought were gone forever. They moved down to Aurora full-time when James was 6 months old, keeping the mountain cabin for summer retreats. Tucker had been promoted to Chief Deputy Marshal, which meant more responsibility but also more control over his schedule. He made sure to be home for dinner every night, to help with the baby, to give Katherine breaks when she needed them. Their house in Aurora was modest but comfortable, with a small yard where Katherine planted a garden. She became friends with Mrs. Henderson and some of the other women in town, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. People who remembered her from before said it was like watching someone come back from the dead, seeing emotion and life return to Katherine Reed's face. When James was 2, Katherine became pregnant again. This time there was less fear and more excitement, though Tucker still caught her sometimes staring at nothing, lost in memories of another pregnancy in another life. But she always came back to him when he touched her shoulder or spoke her name, and the shadows in her eyes grew fainter each time. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1883, a tiny thing with Katherine's blonde hair and Tucker's dark eyes. They named her Grace, because that's what Katherine said the child was, grace and blessing and proof that joy could follow sorrow. Tucker retired from active duty when Grace was born, taking a position as the town's coordinator of law enforcement. It meant less time in the saddle chasing outlaws and more time training deputies and handling administrative matters. The pay was better, the hours more regular, and he got to watch his children grow. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Tucker and Katherine raised their children with love and attention, teaching them to be kind, brave, and honest. James grew into a serious boy who loved books and asked endless questions about everything. Grace was the opposite, wild and fearless, always climbing things she shouldn't and bringing home injured animals to nurse back to health. On lazy Sunday afternoons, the family would sometimes ride up to the mountain cabin and spend a few days there. Tucker would fish in the stream while Katherine worked in her garden and the children played in the meadow. These were the times Tucker loved most, all of them together in the place where his and Katherine's story had truly begun. One evening when James was 8 and Grace was 5, they sat around the cabin's fireplace, roasting apples on sticks. Grace, sticky with apple juice, looked up at her mother and asked, "Mama, why don't you smile as much as other mamas?" Tucker tensed, ready to redirect the conversation, but Katherine just pulled Grace into her lap and smiled down at her daughter. "I smile plenty, little one. I smile every time I look at you and your brother. But Mrs. Henderson smiles all the time, and Mrs. Patterson, you only smile sometimes." Katherine glanced at Tucker, who gave her an encouraging nod. She'd known this conversation would come eventually. "That's because something very sad happened to me a long time ago before you and James were born. It made it hard for me to smile for a while. But I'm much better now, especially with you two in my life." "What sad thing?" James asked, his serious eyes studying his mother's face. Katherine took a breath. "I had a different family once, a husband and a little girl. They got sick and died, and I was very sad for a very long time." Grace's eyes went wide. "You had another little girl." "I did. Her name was Emma. She was 4 years old. Where is she now?" Grace asked, and Tucker saw Katherine's eyes fill with tears. But she didn't look away or shut down. She let the children see her emotion, let them understand that sadness was part of life. "She's in heaven now with her papa, and I miss them every day. But that doesn't mean I love them more than I love you. My heart is big enough for all of you. The love I feel for Emma and her father doesn't take away from the love I feel for you and James and your papa. Do you understand? Grace thought about this seriously, then nodded. I think so. Like how I love Patches the cat and also Copper the horse. Loving one doesn't mean I love the other less. Katherine smiled through her tears. Exactly like that. Very smart, Grace. James scooted closer and hugged his mother from one side while Grace hugged her from the other. Tucker watched his family, his heart full to bursting. This was what Katherine had given him, what they'd built together from pain and loss and the courage to try again. This was life, messy and complicated and absolutely beautiful. Later that night, after the children were asleep in the loft, Tucker and Katherine lay together in the cabin's big bed. You handled that well, Tucker said, stroking her hair. The children needed to know. It felt good to tell them, Katherine admitted. Like Emma is still part of our family in a way, still remembered. I think that would have made her father happy, knowing she wasn't forgotten. What was his name? Tucker asked. In all their years together, Katherine had never mentioned her first husband's name. Robert, Katherine said softly. Robert Franklin. He was a good man, kind and gentle. He would have liked you, I think. I hope so, Tucker said. I'd like to think he'd be glad you found happiness again. He would be. He loved me too much to want me to spend my life alone and sad. Katherine rolled over to face Tucker, propping herself up on one elbow. You know what I realized today? When Grace asked about my smiling, I could answer her honestly without that terrible hollow feeling. The grief is still there, but it doesn't consume me anymore. I can remember Robert and Emma with love instead of just pain. That's your doing, Tucker. You taught me how to live again. No, Tucker said firmly. That was all you, Katherine. I just stood beside you while you did the hard work. You chose to heal. You chose to open your heart again. I was just lucky enough to be there when you did. Katherine kissed him softly. We were both lucky. Two broken people who found each other and built something whole. Not broken, Tucker corrected. Wounded, but healed now, both of us. They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity. Two people who knew every scar and story of each other's bodies and souls. Afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, listening to their children's soft breathing from the loft above. Tucker, Katherine whispered, are you happy? Happier than I ever thought possible, he answered honestly. You? Yes, Katherine said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. So very, very happy. The years continued to pass in Aurora. Tucker and Katherine grew older. Their children grew up. James became a teacher, his love of books and learning turning into a passion for education. He married a smart young woman named Sarah and gave Tucker and Katherine 3 grandchildren. Grace, true to her wild nature, married a surveyor and moved to California, writing long letters home about her adventures in San Francisco. She had 2 children of her own and visited Aurora every summer, bringing the grandchildren to run wild in the same meadows where she'd played as a child. Tucker and Katherine aged gracefully together, their hair going gray, lines deepening around their eyes. But Katherine's face never lost the expressiveness she'd regained. She laughed at Tucker's jokes and cried at sad moments and showed her love clearly for all to see. The blank mask never returned. They spent more and more time at the mountain cabin as they got older, finding peace in the quiet solitude. Tucker taught his grandsons to fish in the stream where he'd once caught trout for Katherine. Katherine showed her granddaughters how to gather eggs from the chickens and tend the vegetable garden. One evening in the summer of 1902, when Tucker was 72 and Katherine was 71, they sat on the cabin porch watching yet another sunset paint the mountains gold. Tucker's joints ached with age and Katherine moved slower than she used to, but they were still together, still in love, still content. You remember the first sunset we watched together, Katherine asked, her hand in Tucker's. I do. Right here on this porch. You were just starting to come back to yourself. You were so scared. I was terrified, Katherine agreed, but you were patient with me. You gave me the time I needed. It was worth every second of waiting, Tucker said. Every single second. Katherine leaned her head on his shoulder. I never thanked you properly, you know. For what you said that first time you came here when you were leaving, about me being the most beautiful thing here. Those words stayed with me through all the weeks you were gone. They were the first kind words anyone had said to me in years that actually penetrated the fog I was living in. Tucker lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles, gnarled now with age but still the same hand he'd held thousands of times. You were the most beautiful thing there. You still are. You're the most beautiful thing wherever you are, Katherine, she laughed softly. I'm an old woman now, Tucker Reed. My hair is gray and my face is wrinkled. And you're still beautiful. More beautiful than the day I met you because now I can see everything you are. Your strength, your courage, your capacity for love, all of it shows on your face now. You're not hidden anymore. You're fully present, fully alive. That's the most beautiful thing in the world. Katherine raised her head to look at him, her eyes bright with tears but also with joy. I love you so much. Thank you for my life, the one you gave back to me. Thank you for sharing it with me, Tucker replied, for letting me be part of your healing, for giving me children and grandchildren and all these years of happiness. You were my salvation too, Katherine. You showed me what was worth living for. They kissed softly, an old couple still deeply in love after more than 20 years of marriage. The sun finally sank below the mountains, leaving them in purple twilight. Stars began to emerge overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first tentative steps toward each other all those years ago. Tucker, Katherine said quietly, when my time comes, I won't be afraid. I know now that life goes on, that love continues. Robert and Emma will be waiting for me and I'll be glad to see them again. But I hope that day is far off because I'm not ready to leave you yet. I want many more sunsets with you. Then that's what we'll have, Tucker promised. As many as the good Lord gives us. And when the time comes for either of us, the one left behind will know that we had something rare and precious. We had real love, Katherine. The kind that heals and strengthens and endures. Not everyone gets that. No, Katherine agreed. Not everyone does. We're lucky. The luckiest, Tucker confirmed. They sat together as night fell completely, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the mountains that had sheltered their love. Inside the cabin, lamps glowed warm and welcoming. Copper the horse, now old and retired, dozed in the barn. The chickens were settled in their coop. Everything was peaceful and right, just as it had been and would be for whatever time they had remaining. Tucker thought back to that first day he'd ridden into this valley, chasing a bank robber and finding something infinitely more valuable. A broken woman with a blank face who taught him that healing was possible, that love could bloom in the darkest places. That courage meant choosing to feel again even when it hurt. Katherine thought about the young marshal who'd looked at her with kind eyes and said she was beautiful when she couldn't feel anything at all, who'd kept coming back week after week, asking nothing except her company, who'd loved her at her worst and helped her find her way back to her best. They'd saved each other, these two wounded souls. And in saving each other, they'd built a life full of love and laughter, children and grandchildren, joy and sorrow and everything in between. They'd lived fully and loved deeply, and that was all anyone could ask for. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night wind whispered through the pines, Tucker and Katherine sat together on their porch, two hearts beating as one, grateful for every moment they'd been given, ready for whatever came next. Their story had started with pain and silence, but it had become something beautiful. A love story for the ages, told in the wild mountains of Nevada, between a marshal who saw past the blank mask and a woman who learned to smile again. And they lived that way, in love and contentment, for many more years until their time finally came. When Tucker passed at the age of 79, Katherine mourned him deeply, but not with the hollow emptiness that had consumed her after her first family's death. She grieved fully, healthily, surrounded by children and grandchildren who held her through the pain. She lived 3 more years, tending her garden, loving her family, and cherishing the memories of the man who'd given her back her life. When she finally joined Tucker, she died peacefully in her sleep at the mountain cabin, a smile on her face, having lived a full and beautiful life. Her family buried her next to Tucker in Aurora's cemetery, and on her headstone they carved words that Tucker had often said to her, "The most beautiful thing," because that's what she'd been to him always, and that's what their love had been, beautiful and enduring and true. Their children and grandchildren continued the tradition of visiting the mountain cabin every summer, keeping it maintained and loved. They told stories of Tucker and Katherine to their own children, keeping alive the tale of the marshal and the woman who never smiled until he helped her find her way back to joy. It became a family legend, a reminder that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that courage meant trying again even after devastating loss. And on quiet summer evenings, when the family gathered on that same porch where Tucker and Katherine had sat so many times, they could almost feel the presence of their ancestors. 2 spirits who'd loved deeply, lived fully, and left behind a legacy of hope and healing that would endure for generations to come. Their story had ended, but the love they'd built continued, spreading through their family like ripples in a pond, touching everyone it reached. It was a good ending to a love story that had begun in silence and sorrow. It was proof that even the most broken hearts could heal, that smiles could return to the saddest faces, and that love, real and true and patient, could work miracles. Tucker Reed and Katherine Finch had found each other when both needed saving, and together they'd built something that death itself couldn't diminish. They'd created a love that would live on forever in the hearts of everyone who knew their story, a testament to the power of patience, kindness, and the courage to open your heart again after it's been shattered.